Also, my tooth is kind of hurting. I have a wisdom tooth. I'm not really feeling the best today, but it had been maybe 3 days since I actually read. It might have been longer than that. It might have been maybe about a week since I've read it. Can't really remember, but starting a new book by the same author, Fyodor Dostoyevsky, from the Notes from Underground. This one is called The Double. I'm just kind of curious to it, so I'll just read the first chapter and kind of feel like taking a nap, to be honest with you. So chapter 1. It was a little before 8 o'clock in the morning when titular counselor Yakov Petrovich Golyadkin awoke after a long sleep, yawned, stretched, and finally opened his eyes wide. However, for about 2 minutes he lay motionless on his bed like a man not yet entirely certain if he has woken up or is still asleep, if everything around him was not actually happening or was simply a continuation of his chaotic daydreaming. But soon Mr. Golyadkin's senses began to take in more clearly and distinctly their normal everyday impressions. The dirty, green, grimy, dusty walls of his little room, his mahogany chest of drawers, his imitation mahogany chairs, his red-painted table, his sofa upholstered with reddish oilskin patterned with tiny green flowers, and finally the clothing he had hastily discarded the night before and thrown in a heap on the sofa glanced familiarly at him. And finally that foul, murky, dreary autumn day peeping into his room through the dim windows with such an angry, sour look that Mr. Golyadkin no longer had any doubts whatsoever that he was lying in bed. In his own fourth-floor flat in huge tenement block in Shistilovoknaya Street in the capital city of St. Petersburg, and not in some distant fairy realm. After making such a momentous discovery, Mr. Golyadkin convulsively closed his eyes as if feeling regret for his recent slumbers and wishing to recall them if only for one brief moment. But a minute later he leaped out of bed in one bound, having in all probability finally hit upon the idea around which his scattered and thoroughly disorganized thoughts had so far been revolving. Once out of bed, he immediately ran over to a small round mirror that stood on the chest of drawers. Although the sleepy, weak-sided countenance and somewhat balding head reflected there were so insignificant as to command no attention at first glance, its owner was obviously perfectly satisfied with all he saw in the mirror. "A fine thing it would be," said Mr. Golyadkin under his breath. "A fine thing it would be if there was something not quite right with me one day. If, for example, some kind of unwanted pimple had popped out up, or something else just as unpleasant. However, it's not too bad. So far, so good. Positively delighted that all was well." Mr. Golyadkin replaced the mirror, and although he was barefoot and still wearing the same apparel in which he usually retired for the night, ran to the window and started anxiously searching for something in the courtyard that was overlooked by the windows of his flat. Evidently, what he discovered in the courtyard was also to his entire satisfaction. His face lit up with a complacent smile. After first taking a peep behind the partition into his servant Petrushka's cubbyhole and convincing himself that he wasn't there, he tiptoed over to the table, unlocked one of the drawers, rummaged around in a far corner, and finally extracted from beneath some old, yellowing papers and various rubbish a worn green wallet. Cautiously opened it and carefully and delightedly peered into its furthest, most secret compartment. Probably the bundle of nice green, gray, blue, red, and other brightly colored banknotes. Looked at Mr. Golyadkin approvingly and cordially as his face was radiant as he placed the open wallet before him on the table and vigorously rubbed his hands in a manner that indicated the greatest satisfaction. At length he drew out his comforting bundle of banknotes and, what's more, for the hundredth time since the previous day, started counting them, carefully smoothing out each note between thumb and index finger. 750 rubles in notes, and he finally murmured in a half whisper, 750 rubles, a tidy sum. "A most agreeable sum," he continued in a voice that was trembling and somewhat weakened by pleasure, squeezing the wad of notes and smiling significantly. "A most agreeable sum, an agreeable sum for anyone. I'd like to see the men for whom that might be a trifling sum. A man could go far with a sum like that." "But what's going on here?" wondered Mr. Golyadkin. "Where's that Petrushka got to?" Still in the same apparel, he took another look behind the partition. Again, there was no sign of Petrushka, only the samovar that had been set on the floor and was quite beside itself, fuming, working itself into a frenzy, constantly threatening to boil over. lisping and burring in its own mysterious language, something that sounded like, "Come and take me, good people. I boiled now and I'm quite ready." To hell with him. To hell with him, thought Mr. Goliadkin. The lazy devil could drive a man to distraction. Where's he loafing around now? In righteous indignation, he went out into the hall that consisted of a small passage with the entrance door at the end. Opening a little and caught sight of his servants surrounded by a sizable crowd of footmen, sun-dried menials, and chance riffraff. Petrushka was busily regaling them with some story, and they were all ears. Evidently, neither the topic of conversation nor the conversation itself were to Mr. Goliadkin's liking, for he immediately summoned Petrushka and returned to his room looking thoroughly dissatisfied and even upset. That wretch would sell anyone for a song, particularly his master, he mused, and he sold me, no doubt about that, and for a few lousy kopecks, I'm prepared to bet. Well, what is it? They brought the livery, sir. Put it on and come over here. After donning the livery, Livery, Petrushka went into his master's room, grinning stupidly. His costume was bizarre in the extreme. He was attired in the green second-hand livery of a footman, trimmed with gold braid, very worn and clearly fashioned to fit someone a good 2 feet taller than Petrushka. He was holding a hat that was also trimmed with gold braid and adorned with feathers, and at his side he wore a footman's sword in a leather scabbard. Finally, to complete the picture, and faithful to his favorite practice of always going around in a state of domestic undress, Petrushka had nothing on his feet. Mr. Goliadkin inspected Petrushka from all angles and was apparently well satisfied. The livery had obviously been hired for some ceremonial occasion. What was more, throughout the inspection, one could clearly see that Petrushka was eyeing his master with a strange air of expectancy and following his every movement with marked curiosity which embarrassed Mr. Goliadkin no end. Well, what about the carriage? That's arrived too. Do we have it for the whole day? The whole day for 25 rubles. And have they brought the boots? Yes, they brought the boots. Nitwit, can't you say, yes, they brought them, sir? Now give them to me. Having expressed his satisfaction that the boots were a good fit, Mr. Goliadkin ordered his tea and his things for washing and shaving. He both shaved and washed with extreme care, hurriedly sipping his tea in between and embarking on the principal and definitive enrobing with. Then he donned an almost completely new pair of trousers, a shirt front with little brass buttons, a waistcoat with a nice, extremely bright little floral pattern. Around his neck he tied a multicolored silk cravat, and finally pulled on his uniform jacket, also quite new and carefully brushed. As he dressed, he glanced lovingly at his boots several times, first raising one foot and then the other to admire their style, constantly whispering something under his breath and occasionally winking with an expressive grimace at every thought that came to him. However, that morning Mr. Goliadkin appeared to be extremely preoccupied, since he hardly noticed the little grins and grimaces directed at him by Petrushka as he helped him dress. At last, when he had checked that all was as it should be and was completely dressed, Mr. Goliadkin slipped his wallet into his pocket and cast a final, admiring glance at Petrushka, who by now had put on his boots and was thus in complete readiness. Observing that everything was duly completed, he scurried busily down the stairs, his heart throbbing with trepidation. A light blue hired carriage embellished with a coat of arms of sort came rolling up to the door with a loud clatter. After exchanging winks with the driver and some idle bystanders, Petrushka saw that his master was seated. In a peculiar voice and barely able to suppress his idiotic laughter, he shouted, "Drive off!" leaped upon the footboard, and with much jingling and creaking, the entire equipage thundered off towards Nevsky Prospect. No sooner had the light blue carriage passed through the gates from Mr. Goliadkin rubbed his hands feverishly and broke into a soft, barely audible chuckle, like some bright spark who has brought off a splendid joke and is tickled pink about it. Immediately after this fit of merriment, however, the laughter gave place to a strange, apprehensive expression on Mr. Goliadkin's face. In spite of the damp weather, he lowered both windows and started scrutinizing passersby to left and right, immediately adopting a decorous and dignified air the moment he noticed someone looking at him. At the junction of Lightinaya Street and Nevsky Prospect, a most disagreeable sensation made Mr. Goliadkin shudder, and frowning like some poor devil whose corn has been accidentally trodden on, he shrank back hurriedly and even fearfully in the darkest corner of his carriage. The fact was, he encountered two of his colleagues, two young clerks from the same department where he himself worked. For their part, the clerks, so it would seem to Mr. Goliadkin, were utterly bewildered at meeting their colleague in these circumstances. One of them even pointed his finger at him. The other, so would appear to Mr. Goliadkin, even shouted his name out loud, which is, of course, most improper in the street. Our hero hid himself and didn't respond. Those urchins, he reflected. So what's so strange about it? If a man needs a carriage, he simply goes and hires one, but all they are is riffraff. I know them, just little brats who could do with the good thrashing. All they think of after they're paid their wages is playing pitch and toss or roaming around the streets. That's all they're concerned with. I'd like to give them a piece of my mind, only Mr. Golyakin didn't finish and he froze. A pair of lively Kazan horses, very well known to Mr. Golyakin and hitched to a fancy drosky, were rapidly overhauling his carriage on the right. The gentleman seated in the droshky, happening to catch sight of the face of Mr. Golyakin, who had rather rashly poked his head out of the window, also appeared absolutely amazed at such an unexpected encounter. Leaning out as far as he could, he started peering with the greatest curiosity and interest into that corner of the carriage where our hero had made haste to conceal himself. The gentleman in the droshky was none other than Andrei Filipovich, head of the same department where Mr. Golyakin was employed as assistant to his chief clerk. When he realized that hiding was impossible, since Andrei Filipovich had fully recognized him as was staring at him, wide-eyed, Mr. Golyakin blushed to his ears. Should I bow or not? Should I respond or not? Should I acknowledge it's me or not? Wondered our hero in indescribable anguish. Or should I pretend it's not me but someone else remarkably like me and look as if nothing were the matter? Really, it's not me at all, and that's the end of it, exclaimed Mr. Golyakin, doffing his hat to Andrei Filipovich, and without taking his eyes off him. I'm all right, he barely managed to whisper. I'm all right, quite all right. It's not me at all, not me at all. Andrei Filipovich, oh no, and that's all there is to it. However, the droshky soon overtook the carriage, and no longer was he subjected to the magnetic power of the head of the department's gaze, but he still was blushing, smiling, and muttering to himself. I was a fool not to respond, he thought at length. I should simply have taken a bolder approach, with an outspokenness not lacking in nobility. I should have told him. So that's how it is, Andrei Filipovich. I've been invited to a dinner as well, so there you are. And then suddenly remembering that he had made a hash of things, our hero reddened like fire, scowled, and cast a terrible and defiant look at the front corner of the carriage. A look positively calculated to reduce all his enemies to ashes in one instant. Finally, in the sudden fit of inspiration, he tugged the cord attached to the driver's elbow, stopped the carriage, and gave instructions to turn back to the Light Naya Street. The truth was, Mr. Golyakin had an urgent need, probably for his own peace of mind, to tell his doctor, Christian Ivanovich Rudenspitz, something of the greatest interest, and although he hadn't known the doctor for very long at all, he called on him only once for something he needed the previous week. But a doctor is like a confessor, and it would have been stupid to hide himself away since, after all, it is a doctor's responsibility to know his patients. Will it be all right, our hero continued, alighting from his carriage at the entrance to a 5-story building in Light Naya Street where he had ordered the driver to stop. Will it be all right? Will it be proper to call on him? Will it be convenient? Ah, well, that of it, he added, pausing to catch his breath as he mounted the stairs to stop his heart pounding as it was wont to do on the staircases of others. Well, what of it? After all, I've come about what concerns me personally, and there's nothing reprehensible about that. It would have been stupid to hide myself away, so I'll just pretend I'm all right, that I came for no special reason, but simply happened to be passing. He'll see that I'm in fact doing the right thing. Reasoning thus, Mr. Golyakin went up to the second floor and stopped outside the flat number 5, whose door bore a handsome brass plate with the inscription, Christian Ivanovich Rudenspitz, Doctor of Medicine and Surgery. As he stood there, our hero lost no time in giving his countenance a relaxed, seemingly expression that was not lacking in a certain degree of affability. He prepared to pull the bell, but just as he was about to ring, he immediately and quite appropriately concluded that might it not be better to return to tomorrow, as for the time being there was nothing he really needed. However, when Mr. Golyakin suddenly heard footsteps on the stairs, he hastily reversed his decision, and at the same time rang Dr. Rutenspitz's bell with the most determined air. So, Mr. Golyakin, I guess, is our main character, and he's heading to an event, but I guess he was embarrassed to see the other people going. I guess other more richer, more successful people. He shouldn't have cheesed up. At least just say hi, even if you do have to be even people who are more successful than other people, you both have to, me have to get over, or not me, but let's say if I'm not as successful as somebody, I have to get over the fact that I'm not as successful as them. We let that feeling pass, everybody wants to be respectful, and you just kind of keep conversating, and you let those feelings pass. But then And a successful person, unless they don't like you, then they'll try to rub it in your face, or for the most part, they just kind of like, they don't judge you. They're just a little more successful in their life. Which is blessings. So come on, Mister. We should just call him Golly, but it's Golly Adkin. Golly Adkin. I think it's like a German book, or this is like a Russian book or something. But I'm on chapter 2 now. Anyway, seems okay so far. We'll see what's going on. It just seems like another one of those. Maybe he's gonna go to some sort of place where I don't know. I have no idea. Anyway, we'll see. Peace.